The Iowa-class battleships were among the last battleships ever built by the United States, and they quickly became some of the most famous warships in American naval history. Long, fast, and armed with some of the most powerful naval guns ever put to sea, these ships represented the peak of American battleship design. Among them was the legendary Missouri, the ship on whose deck the Japanese Empire formally surrendered in 1945, bringing the Second World War to an end. But the story of the Iowa class is much bigger than a single historic moment. These battleships were built at a turning point in naval warfare, when aircraft carriers were beginning to dominate the oceans, yet the age of the battleship had not fully passed. They would escort fast carrier task forces across the Pacific, bombard enemy shores, and remain in service for nearly half a century. From World War II to the Cold War and even into the 1990s, the Iowa-class battleships became some of the most famous warships ever built. So how did these ships come to exist? Why were they built the way they were? And how did they manage to remain relevant for so long? This is the story of the Iowa-class battleships. In the late 1930s, the United States Navy faced a difficult problem. For nearly 2 decades, battleship construction had been heavily restricted by a series of international naval treaties. Agreements such as the Washington Naval Treaty and the London Naval Treaty placed strict limits on the size, armament, and total number of battleships that the world's major naval powers were allowed to build. For a time, these treaties slowed the global naval arms race, but by the mid-1930s, the system was beginning to break down. Japan withdrew from the treaty framework, and the possibility of a large-scale naval conflict in the Pacific became increasingly likely. As tension rose, the United States Navy began planning the next generation of battleships. Earlier American fast battleships, such as the North Carolina and South Dakota, were powerful ships, but they were still limited by treaty restrictions. Their maximum speed was about 27 knots, fast for battleships of their time, but not fast enough for the evolving tactics of naval warfare. By the late 1930s, the Navy was increasingly focused on the growing importance of aircraft carriers. New carriers, like the Essex-class aircraft carrier, were capable of speeds of more than 30 knots. Any battleship intended to operate with these carrier task forces would need to match that speed. This requirement became one of the defining features of the future Iowa class. The Navy wanted a battleship that could combine 3 qualities that rarely appeared together in a single design: heavy firepower, strong armor protection, and very high speed. But achieving this combination was not easy. One of the most important constraints was the Panama Canal. For strategic flexibility, United States battleships needed to be able to move quickly between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This meant they had to fit through the canal's lock, which limited the maximum beam of the ship just over 108 feet. This restriction forced naval architects to design a ship that was unusually long and relatively narrow for its displacement. The result was a sleek hull form that helped the ship achieve high speeds while still staying within the canal's limit size. With the growing threat of war, the United States Congress authorized the construction of a new class of fast battleships under the Naval Act of 1938, which greatly expanded the size of the United States Navy. The new ships would become the Iowa-class battleship. Even the future President of the United States spoke about the significance of these ships.
The Missouri and her 3 sister ships, the Iowa, the New Jersey, and the Wisconsin, would be the largest and the finest warships in the world. And the armament to be installed in the Missouri will make her the most formidable craft afloat. The christening and launching of this greatest warship of all time illustrates the decisive answer which the democracies of the world are making to the challenge of the aggressor nations. The battleship Missouri will show all Americans, indeed all the world, her innate seaworthiness, her valiant fighting spirit, and the invincible power of the United States Navy.
Construction of the new fast battleships was spread across several major American naval shipyards. The lead ship Iowa was built at the New York Naval Shipyard in Brooklyn. The same yard would later construct another famous ship of the class, Missouri. 2 additional ships, New Jersey and Wisconsin, were built at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, one of the largest naval construction facilities in the United States. Two more ships were planned as a part of the class, Illinois and Kentucky. Illinois was laid down in Philadelphia, while Kentucky began construction at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. However, as the war progressed and aircraft carriers became the dominant force in naval warfare, construction priorities began to shift. Both ships were eventually cancelled before completion. By the time the first vessels of the class entered service, the United States was already fully engaged in World War II, and these new battleships would soon be sent to the Pacific to join the growing American fleet. Before we look at how these ships were used in the war, let's first take a look at their main characteristics and what made them such powerful warships. This footage shows sailors of the Iowa-class battleship handling the massive shells used by the ship's main guns. Each of these projectiles weighed more than a ton and required careful coordination to move across the deck. Using rails and specialized equipment, the crew guided the shells towards the gun turrets, where they would later be loaded into the battleship's 16-inch guns. Scenes like this reveal just how much manpower was needed to operate these enormous weapons and give a glimpse into the scale of the firepower carried by the Iowa-class battleships. Fully loaded, each ship displaced more than 57 tons of water. To imagine that scale, that is roughly the same weight as more than 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools filled with water. The ships themselves stretched nearly 270 meters in length, longer than 3 football fields, making them some of the largest warships ever constructed by the United States Navy. But the true strength of these ships was not only their size, it was a combination of firepower, engineering, and the thousands of sailors required to operate them. During the Second World War, each Iowa-class battleship carried a crew of more than 2,700 officers and enlisted sailors. Operating a ship of this scale required constant coordination. Deep inside the hull, engineers and mechanics maintained the massive machinery that powered the ship. High above the deck, radar operators tracked aircraft and service contacts. And inside the heavily armored turrets, gun crews prepared the ship's most famous weapons. The main armament of the Iowa class consisted of 9 16-inch naval guns mounted in 3 enormous turrets. Each of these guns could fire armor-piercing shells weighted around 1,200 kilograms, heavier than a small car. The shells were propelled using large bags of powder and could travel more than 30 kilometers. Loading these guns was an impressive mechanic process. Let's take a look on it. When all 9 guns fired together in a full broadside, the battleship could send nearly 12 tons of steel toward its target in a single salvo. The blast from these guns was so powerful that the shockwave could be felt throughout the entire ship, and the deck would often disappear into clouds of smoke and flame. Soon after entering service, the Iowa-class battleship were sent to the Pacific, where the United States Navy was fighting a massive naval campaign against the Imperial Japanese Navy during World War II. Rather than fighting traditional battleship duels, these ships often operated as part of large carrier task forces. Their high speed allowed them to escort fast aircraft carriers, protecting them from enemy ships and aircraft. Throughout the war, the Iowa-class battleships supported major operations across the Pacific. They escorted carrier groups during strikes against Japanese positions and took part in shore bombardments, using their massive guns to attack coastal defenses before amphibious landings. Ships of the class were present during operations across the Central Pacific, including the campaigns for the Mariana Island and later during the battles around Okinawa in 1945. One of the most famous moments in the history of the class came at the very end of the war. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender of Japan was signed aboard Missouri, making the end of Second World War. After the war, many battleships around the world were retired, as aircraft carriers and naval aviation became the dominant force at sea. However, the Iowa-class battleships would continue to serve. Only a few years later, they were called back into action during the Korean War. During this conflict, their powerful guns proved highly effective for coastal bombardment. The ships attacked enemy positions along the Korean coastline, supporting United Nations forces fighting on the peninsula. Although the era of the battleship was gradually coming to an end, the Iowa-class ships continued to demonstrate that their enormous firepower still had a role to play in modern warfare.